All right, so we start chapter 19, the respiratory system, looking at the upper respiratory system. So the respiratory system in general is just a way to give our body an area of gas exchange, but it also has other things going on. It consists of passages that filter and moisten and warm the incoming air to try and get it into the same temperature and humidity as our body as it gets into the lungs. Remember, the lungs are going to be made up mainly of simple squamous little air bubbles called alveoli. And so they're very fragile, and so we want to make sure we have the air as close to normal of body composition as we can. So at the end of this respiratory system is where we're going to find those little microscopic sacs that I was talking about. And at that point, we will have gas exchange, and that is specifically called respiration. Respiration is the process of exchanging gases between the atmosphere and body cells. So when we talk about respiration, there's a couple of things that are going to go on, a little process. You have ventilation, which is breathing in and then breathing out. During that, we're going to have external respiration. This is what happens in the lungs. The lungs are considered, in a way, external. We're going to learn that the GI tract's the same thing because it is the air that's in my lungs is actually external air. So it's an external area. So external respiration is when we're going to add oxygen and we're going to get rid of carbon dioxide. All right, so that's external respiration. It happens in the lungs. And then that good oxygen is going to be taken from the lungs and then out to the body cells. At that point, we will have internal respiration. Internal respiration is where we are going to take that oxygen, put it into the cells, and then take the carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct, and remove it. And at that point, the oxygen is going to be used to break down glucose, which is what we call cellular respiration, which is what produces the CO2. It gets carried back to the lungs, and the whole process starts all over again. Remember, external respiration is what happens in the lungs. Internal respiration is what happens in the body tissue. Now, respiration is considered a macroscopic process, but there are microscopic things that go on. Now, gas exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide, occurs at the cellular and molecular levels. Aerobic reactions, which we've learned before. Aerobic reactions are the second two stages of or steps of cellular respiration. This is going to happen in the cytoplasm, and it is where we're going to use that oxygen, which is what aerobic means, with oxygen, to produce ATP. All right? This is what gives us the energy to run our bodies. And so as we do this, the waste product is carbon dioxide. It's the metabolic waste. And so if I was to write it out, we got C6H on this. I probably shouldn't have tried this. Let me get back here to C6H12O6. As this gets broken down, we're going to produce these two. As that gets broken down in the presence of, and I should put here, in the presence of oxygen, we end up making carbon dioxide and water. And that's why, and it's what we breathe out. Now, carbon dioxide and water in our body is going to be catalyzed into something called carbonic acid, and we're going to look at this a lot more as we get into the more chemical processes in the later couple of videos. Carbonic acid and its breakdown, which is bicarbonate, is going to be a big buffer system for our body, the pH. So the respiratory system is going to provide the O2 for aerobic reactions. It's going to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and it's going to, in doing that, it's going to use this in a form that helps regulate the pH. Again, we're going to get a lot more into this as we go on. But this is where this set of slides is going to be kind of covering. This is going to be the dividing line. So our respiratory system has what's called an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. The key is this area here. Now, I will tell you that even in the last edition of this book, the larynx was considered part of the lower respiratory tract. That's the way I learned it. This is what I'll tell you. Don't really worry about whether it's in the upper or lower respiratory tract. You need to know the larynx is the area that divides the two. And again, it's kind of, we've looked at this thing called the pharynx. You're going to see this a lot in lab. And the pharynx is going to have an area here, and it's going to be tied to this little thing, the larynx. This is the dividing line. Anything behind it is going to go to the esophagus and down to the stomach. Anything anterior, this is what we'll look at. It goes down to the lungs. But that is the dividing line here. That is the difference between the upper and lower respiratory tract. And a way to remember it in a very generic way, anything above this is in the head. That's the upper respiratory tract, so that's a head cold. Anything below that is in the lower respiratory tract. That's a chest cold. So when we start it in the upper respiratory tract, we start with the nose. The nose has two openings called nostrils, and they are actually called nares. That's the scientific word for it, external nares. That's what you breathe in through. It's going to have, I'm not worried about, I'm definitely not going to ask questions about the internal hairs and stuff, although we should know that. All joking aside, it's a good thing, but joking added, it's really pretty gross, and I don't want to talk about internal hairs of the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity, which is the hollow space behind the nose, hopefully everybody's good with that, separated by this thing called a nasal septum. There are two bones that make up the nasal septum. The one that is considered the nasal septum is called the volar bone, and I would know that. It has these things called nasal concha. Now we'll see this a lot more in lab, so if I'm looking at the skull and I'm looking straight on, and I've got this little area, the nasal cavity, off on the sides of the nasal cavity, there are these little wing-like things that come off of it, and these are called nasal concha. And their job is when I breathe through my nose, it causes the air to circulate. And that means that 100% of that air is going to rub across the nasal mucosa and be filtered. The area below here, so if I had a little X and put it here or here, the little area that is beneath the nasal concha, the little half pike wave, is called a meatus, because there's a long little tube right through here, and that's what allows that air to circulate. Now the upper portion, I'm going to have olfactory receptors that hang down in here, and what they're going to be doing is they're going to be extending through what we looked at as the cribriform plate back, when we were looking at this in 210. So the cribriform plate and that area of the ethmoid bone, you had the sella turcica with the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, and just above that you had the little area of the cribriform plate with the crista galla. That's where that cribriform plate's where these olfactory receptors are going to stick down. Now the nasal mucosis, the mucous membrane is going to be lined with cilia, and it's going to be pseudostratified. Columnar epithelium, that's what we learned in 210 when you were looking anyway. It is going to condition the air. It will warm and moisten and filter the incoming air. The nasal concha support the mucous membrane that lines the nasal cavity. Now, one of the big things about this, and we're dealing with it now, people wear masks and whatever to try and protect themselves. And while the masks are good, they're unless you've got the right type, it's going to be hard to filter things. But I will tell you that no matter what it is, breathing through your nose will help filter all the air that comes in, and you would be surprised at the amount of pathogens that will get filtered in the nasal cavity before it even gets in the pharynx or what we would call the throat to where your tonsils are, that will get filtered out and removed before it even gets in. So especially in today's world like we're dealing with now, when you're out somewhere, even if you are wearing a mask, try to breathe through your nose as much as you can. It helps filter things out. The goblet cells are going to be here. We looked at this again. You should have looked at this in 210. The goblet cells produce mucus, right? And then in the mucus, it's going to trap pathogens and particles, and then they will get caught by the cilia and moved away. So this is going to filter particles and microorganisms. The cilia is going to sweep it away, and then they're going to be destroyed, hopefully. Now, inside the upper respiratory tract, there is going to be areas in the bones of the skull that are called sinuses. Sinuses, the name sinus simply means hollow area, but there are hollow areas in the cranial bones, and they are also lined with a mucous membrane. That is why if you have a head cold or sinusitis, it is really painful because the mucous membrane is going to be inflamed. Again, not worried too much about this red spot. I should have, the clinical application, I left it in. Cigarette smoking is really bad, but just to give you some ideas of things here, not going to test you on anything on this. Now the pharynx is this tube, and if I draw a little line here on the black part here, this with the black line, this is the pharynx. Now the pharynx is the space posterior to the nasal cavity. It is a shared tube. Basically it'd be what we would think of as the throat, and I'm going to use a different color here. Let me go back to red, and I'm going to look at, there's three portions of the pharynx: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngenopharynx. The nasopharynx is the area that is behind the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is the area behind the oral cavity. Right, let me get this here. And then the laryngenopharynx is the area just next to the larynx. Now, what you will learn as we go along here, the larynx is actually an area. The larynx is an area. We'll learn it for structures that are there, but the larynx is an area. So those are the three parts of the pharynx: the nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx behind the oral cavity, the laryngenopharynx behind the larynx. And we're going to look at this a couple more times. We'll look at this for lab, and we're going to look at this in the digestive system, because the nasopharynx is really the one area that should be dedicated to the respiratory system. Hopefully no one's having to breathe through or eat through their nose. The oropharynx, this little area here, this is a shared portion because it is about, you can breathe and eat through it. And then the laryngenopharynx is just the sorting area. This is where we're going to decide, are we going to the stomach or are we going to the lungs? Now the larynx, again, this is this special area. This is going to be an enlargement. You're going to see certain things in here where this is where your vocal cords are going to be stored. It's going to have a lot of special things like these three small cartilages here. I'm going to tell you, I am not going to ask you about those, so don't worry about those. These here you will need to know. So first and foremost, the thyroid cartilage is the main one. This is, if you, obviously you should be able to tell me what gland is going to be associated with the thyroid cartilage, right? The thyroid gland. But the thyroid cartilage is the largest of all of these, all the parts of the larynx. It's kind of the defining feature. On males, it is more pronounced. There is more of and that's why they call it an Adam's apple. There's a bump there. For females, it's an area to pay attention to. If you feel a lump or a bump start forming there, you need to go get it checked out because it might be a problem with the thyroid gland. Then we have what's called the cricoid cartilage, which is the lower border of it. It's a little bit larger than all the cartilage parts of the trachea, and it is not anywhere near as large, though, as the thyroid. So you got the thyroid, which is really easy, and then this cricoid, which is just underneath it. The epiglottic, or epiglottis, we will look at in a different way, but the epiglottis is that little elastic cartilage flap that's designed to close over our trachea as we go to swallow to send the food to the stomach. On the next slide, we'll see it a little better. So, actually, I'm sorry, in the slide following this, we should see it a little better. But this is the area we call the vocal cords. There's two types of vocal cords, false vocal cords and true vocal cords. Hopefully you can figure out that true vocal cords are the areas that actually make noise. The false vocal cords have no sound production. They are there to kind of help along the way. The false vocal cords are going to be a little bit more superior. This is an actual picture of the area. These areas right in here on either side, these are the areas of the false vocal cords that are a little bit superior. So when I go to try to hold my breath and close my throat, if or something's dusty, this happens automatically, that these will close over and they will protect the things underneath them, which are these guys, which are the true vocal cords. The true vocal cords actually vibrate and make sound. And so the false vocal cords are a little bit superior. They do not make sound. They're a little off to the sides, where the true vocal cords are these tightened bands all along here. Now, the other thing I want to point out here that's not on this, I'm not worried. I'll never ask you about the epiglottis this way, or in this picture I'll show you how it would be on another picture as we move along. But what I do want you to know, this hollow opening is called the glottis. The glottis is the hollow opening between the true vocal cords. That's why this called the epiglottis, right? Epi means above or outer. Hopefully you learned that in 210. So the epiglottis, when you go to swallow, the epiglottis will come down and close over the glottis.